Great. So, I'm very pleased to talk to you today about cultural diversity in normative beliefs about sharing. I want to start just by noting that the content of this talk is going to differ from my abstract in a few small ways, and the title obviously differs a little bit, but I'll flag why, and the reasons will be clear as we go along. But thematically, it's going to be identical. So, across a range of different paradigms, we see diversity in sharing behavior across different societies and across different cultural groups. And so our question today really is why? What drives this behavior? And we think one plausible hypothesis is that normative beliefs about sharing play an important role. We're defining this pretty broadly as beliefs regarding what people ought to do, should do, or what is right to do in the context of resource sharing. So generally, beliefs with this kind of injunctive force to them. And of course, there's this problem with research that focuses on sharing behavior, which is that sharing behavior doesn't straightforwardly tell you about normative beliefs. And also, you can have cases where different patterns of normative beliefs lead to precisely the same sharing behavior. So, it's conceivable that, for example, you have a person A who says it's right to be egalitarian, to distribute resources equally, and it's wrong to be self-maximizing. It's wrong to take more resources for yourself, and one should be egalitarian. Whereas person B might say it's right to be egalitarian as well, but it's not wrong to be self-maximizing, and perhaps what one should do is be generous, to give more away to others. As I say, it's conceivable that these individuals could hold these different patterns of beliefs, yet still produce egalitarian sharing behavior. And so really, we need to uncover the structure of normative beliefs. How can different normative beliefs vary across individuals, and what kinds of tools and questions can we use to understand the structure of normative beliefs? And of course, we think that understanding development is key to this question. So we see cross-cultural variation in sharing behavior emerges really in middle childhood. So around 4 or 5 years of age, children across different societies tend to be self-maximizing when it comes to resource distributions. But around 6 to 8 years, you see diversity such that in some contexts you see more egalitarian patterns of sharing, others remain self-maximizing, in some cases you get generosity, and so on. But the question here is, does this reflect the acquisition of normative beliefs, or perhaps conformity to beliefs that were acquired earlier in development? And part of the challenge here is that research from Smith and colleagues indicates that American children around 4 years of age say that they should be egalitarian, but in practice they're not. So we have what they call a knowledge behavior gap, or belief behavior gap. So to try and understand the course of this development, we need to look at the development of children's normative beliefs specifically across cultural groups. And we also think it's worth understanding other influences on normative beliefs, such as the beliefs of those children's caregivers. So this is what we did. We had a wide range, age range of children, so 3.5 to 12 years, and we tested their caregivers in a series of binary choice dictator games, which I'll explain in a moment. But this is a really useful sort of sandbox for exploring resource sharing that can be used across different societies and at different ages. But what we tried to do is to more directly assess normative beliefs. And we did this by asking questions about what children thought they should do or what was right and wrong to do. And we looked at this cross-culturally in 2 societies where we'd expect to see quite large differences in normative beliefs, sort of based on prior hypotheses that in highly industrialized and market-integrated societies, you tend to see egalitarian patterns of resource sharing. We had the UK as an exemplar of that, and we contrasted this with individuals living in rural Uganda. And so we had 185 children in Uganda and their caregivers, and 166 children in the UK, and the discrepancy you're seeing there is because siblings took part in the study. As I said, it was a binary choice scenario, and we had these tokens that were exchanged for awards. So they actually took part in a number of different tasks, not all of them to do with resource sharing, and across these tasks, tokens were exchanged for awards, and we checked they were motivated to pursue a larger number of tokens, and then we checked specifically for their comprehension of the binary choice scenario. So we're happy that they understood those different aspects, and they were motivated to pursue a large number of tokens. And if you're not familiar with the binary choice dictator game, this is the setup. So you have your participant, then you have an other. So that's not a live person, but an image that represents someone in their cultural setting. So it's a peer stranger, age and gender matched, and plausibly from the same cultural group. And then you present them with 2 boards which represent 2 distinct choices. with two sets of circles. The participant receives whatever is on the red circle, and the other, they're told that the next day or some point later, they'll receive whatever they put on the blue circles. So you can see here you've got an egalitarian distribution where the child will receive 2 and the other will receive 2 tokens, and what we call self-maximizing distribution where the child gets 3 and the other gets 1. So in the first task, we asked children using the should question. How should you share? So following the procedure of Fair and colleagues, we sought to identify strategies that emerge across multiple game scenarios. So rather than just focusing on a single one-shot dictator game, you can build up a picture of their strategy as it emerges across these games. But instead of just focusing on their actual behavior, we asked them which one should you choose. And these were the 3 scenarios. So you had egalitarian versus preventing the other from receiving the same as oneself, egalitarian versus taking more for oneself, and egalitarian versus enabling the other to end up with more than oneself. And so if an individual always chooses the egalitarian distribution, we call that being strongly egalitarian. And there's a weak version, which is, I should say before then that this is the pattern that you see in a lot of industrialized and market-integrated societies. So your examples from Spain, Switzerland, and China. So obviously interesting that cuts across the individualist, collectivist kind of distinction there. And this is the weak version where you're egalitarian unless it's personally costly. So in that middle scenario, you choose to take 2 for yourself. Then we have a generous option, that final choice if you choose to be generous. So there's strong and weak versions of being generous. So this is weakly generous. And then you can be competitive. So you always prevent the other from ending up with more than yourself, or you take more than them if you can. So this gives us 5 what we call coherent strategies. There are 3 ambiguous strategies that I'm not going to focus on here. Suffice to say they were chosen at low rates, below chance rates in both children and caregivers across both cultural groups. So I'm not going to talk about them really anymore. So I'm going to start by talking about the caregiver strategies, partly just as kind of representatives of adults in that cultural context. So the kind of pink-purple colour here is UK, orange Uganda. And first I'll show you this, which shows a stark difference in the strongly egalitarian strategy. So on the y-axis, you've got the probability of choosing that strategy. And you can see there's quite a strong difference here. But it's kind of, there are differences amongst the other strategies. So you can see that in Uganda, they were more likely to choose the weakly egalitarian and weakly generous strategies. What you also notice is that one of the key differences here is this idea of a kind of singular versus diverse strategies. So in the UK, there's a tendency to have this kind of modal strategy, although I do note that 1 in 5 were strongly generous and a few were competitive, but by and large, most of them were strongly egalitarian, whereas in Uganda, it seems to be kind of have this more diverse range of strategies, which we think is an interesting point of contrast when it can be tempting to think of societies as being singularly egalitarian or being some other strategy or belief type. So then looking at the children, we built models with a binary outcome for strategy type. So we had a separate model for each strategy type. And as predictors, we had the caregiver strategy, age and cultural group. And I'm going to present the 3 strategies where we saw cross-cultural differences. In both cultures, we did see a subset of children being strongly generous and competitive. But what you see really is this striking difference in the strongly egalitarian strategy. So on the right, you've got the caregiver strategy, just put there for reference. And what you see here is that with age, children in the UK really kind of tend towards becoming, it's cross-sectional design, but they tend towards a strongly egalitarian strategy with age. Whereas in Uganda, it remains at low rates throughout. Again, for the weakly generous strategy, as with the caregivers, we see a cross-cultural difference. This is an age-culture interaction as well, but you can see this kind of driven by this kind of cratering in the number of weakly generous children in the UK. And there is a cross-cultural difference, but no age interaction for the weakly egalitarian strategy, such that children in Uganda were more likely to be weakly egalitarian. So what we see is this kind of age-related shift in the UK towards that tendency we saw amongst the adults to be strongly egalitarian. And in Uganda, we end up with this kind of comparable population-level mix of strategies that was kind of similar to caregivers. So, a number of weakly egalitarian children, a number of weakly generous children. There were these cross-cultural differences, but of course, because of this difference in distribution of the strategies, the developmental trajectory doesn't follow that same trajectory that you see for strong egalitarian. What you do see is this kind of quite striking cross-cultural difference, and I think that's one of the key kind of takeaways, and the fact that you have this difference in singular versus diverse strategies. So that's the should question. In the next task, we focus on the questions about right and wrong. So again, we had 3 binary games, but in this case, we had egalitarian versus self-maximizing choices in each case. They only differed in terms of the size of the distributions of the number of tokens, and we had no reason to expect a difference there, so I'm not going to focus on that. And we wanted to not view these as necessarily like mirrors of each other. So we see there's an egalitarian choice, and we cover the self-maximizing side and focus on the egalitarian side. And we ask 2 questions. Is it right to choose this one? And is it wrong to choose this one? So notice here we're not seeing these as necessarily strict opposites. You can say it's right and it's not wrong, but you can also say it's not right and it's not wrong, for example. Then we cover this side and we do the same with the self-maximizing side. Is it right? Is it wrong? And then we give them the opportunity to make a choice in this kind of forced binary scenario. So in this case, we gave caregivers just a single game and children completed 3. And as you'll note, you have the option of saying this is right and it's wrong. Now, it's kind of possible this is a deliberate strategy, but we couldn't really be confident this is the case. And what we see is there's very high levels of this response in Uganda amongst caregivers and children. And we were going to kind of focus on those who didn't produce this response, but our Ugandan researchers thought this is most likely a lack of understanding rather than some other type of strategy. And more likely a kind of desirability bias. And we were going to report the non-excluded data from Uganda, but again, we can't really be confident that these results are kind of free of bias or kind of representative. So we kind of take this in a lesson in how we develop the task. Like, we did use back translation, and we would have done a bit more piloting. We did pilot it, but we didn't have time to look at the results due to time pressures on the study. And so if we did it again, we'd take a bit more time to test these questions out, look at the patterns of results, co-develop them with families in Uganda. So that's the kind of one of the takeaways from this, but I think it's interesting to see the patterns of results in the UK, hopefully as well, for what it tells us about normative belief development. So what we see is that egalitarian beliefs become consistent with age. So in these models, we predict children's moral belief responses across the 3 games, so a kind of proportional measure with age and caregiver moral belief responses. And so this is what we see. So first look at the caregivers. You see that they're pretty much at ceiling. Overwhelmingly, UK caregivers say it's right to be egalitarian. And children in the UK come to think that it's right to be egalitarian with age, with this difference kind of emerging in that middle childhood, 6 to 8 years. Then egalitarian wrong is basically a mirror. Caregivers are at floor. Overwhelmingly, UK caregivers say it's not wrong to be egalitarian. And children come to believe this with age as well. Now, we might expect for the self-maximizing choice, we have another mirror, right? So it's just this flipped again. But this isn't what we see. It's more diverse. So if we look at whether it's right to be self-maximizing, you notice already that caregivers are much more likely to say it's right to be self-maximizing. They're not at the floor in the same way. And children come to believe that it's not right to be self-maximizing with age, but this is less of a kind of stark and steep descent, and they don't really hit that kind of floor level that you saw with egalitarian wrong. And things get really interesting when you look at whether it's wrong to be self-maximizing. So first, draw your attention to the caregivers. Caregivers in the UK are kind of split 50-50 on whether it's wrong to be self-maximizing. Then draw your attention to the dark blue line on this. And what that's showing is that the children of caregivers who said it's wrong to be self-maximizing were more likely to say themselves that it's wrong to be self-maximizing, but only at older ages. So obviously, we can't draw a causal inference that caregivers are directly causing this change in children's belief. There could be some third variable that explains it, but we only detect this effect when we look at self-maximizing beliefs, and only when we look specifically at whether it's wrong to be self-maximizing. So we think this is a kind of helpful insight in terms of you have to look at this level of specificity to really draw out this variation in beliefs amongst caregivers and this potential impact of caregivers on their children. Lastly, I'm going to talk about this relation between beliefs and behavior. So in these models, we predicted the proportion of tasks in which children chose to be egalitarian versus self-maximizing in that forced binary choice. We predict that with age and children's moral belief responses. And we see this age belief interaction. So for egalitarian right, what you're seeing here on the y-axis is the probability of actually choosing to be egalitarian versus self-maximizing. And this dark blue line represents if they said it was right in all 3 scenarios, right in 2, right in 1. So it's essentially kind of like strength of their belief that it's right to be egalitarian. And so you actually already see a difference at this younger age at around 4 or 5. where if you strongly believe it's right to be egalitarian, you're more likely to be egalitarian. But really, at older ages, you see this real sorting where it's those who strongly believe that it's right to be egalitarian who actually produce that behavior. So this is kind of evidence for this knowledge-behavior gap type effect. And we see this inverted for whether it's wrong to be egalitarian. If you say it's not wrong to be egalitarian, you're more likely to then be egalitarian. And if you're interested, I have a couple of bonus slides that show this effect for a completely separate continuous dictator game where children can allocate up to 9 tokens, where beliefs in that first test also have this knowledge-behavior gap type effect, and for this second test as well. Lastly, we see that self-maximizing moral beliefs also predict actual choices, but there's no age interaction. And so we think this may be because self-maximizing decisions may be kind of less normatively implicated because they're kind of more self-focused. Okay, so to quickly wrap up then, we see these substantial cross-cultural variations in normative beliefs and this difference in norm diversity versus having like a kind of modal dominant single belief. We see these beliefs are complex. Even within this seemingly strongly egalitarian society in the UK, we see that a chunk of them, 1 in 5, are strongly generous. We see variation in their beliefs about whether it's wrong to be self-maximizing and whether it's right to be self-maximizing. So I think we need to, going forward, look at the right ways to assess the structure of normative beliefs. What are the appropriate questions or methods to use to look at how normative beliefs vary? We think this could be a way of understanding variation between societies that are labeled as egalitarian. And lastly, we observe this knowledge-behavior gap. The gap diminishes during middle childhood, but this is also the period where beliefs become more like the adults. So it seems like there's a kind of concurrent development here rather than the beliefs are acquired and then later conformed to. And it may be that certain beliefs are influenced by caregivers. And so really to understand variation in sharing behavior, we think we really need to understand variation in these normative sharing beliefs. So thank you to our many collaborators and to our funders and for you for listening.